My name is Matthew. Today I'm going to be giving this presentation called the Starter Project Deep Dive. This is a picture of me. I'm the previous president of the Carl Dampier Science Society. I don't know, at this point, I'm like almost graduated. I have a full-time job, and this is like my 6th year here. So I've been here a long time, done a lot of volunteering here at Carleton. It's a really great place, really nice community for all those of you who are in first year and who are, interested in getting involved at Carleton, stuff like that. So gotta, rep that. You're probably wondering, like, what is the Starter Project Deep Dive? Like, what are you actually here to see? What are you attending, if you will? Well, it's a couple different things. It's a talk and not a workshop. You won't have to code. All you have to do is try and pay attention. There's going to be a lot of stuff I'm probably going to say. Some of it might not make any sense whatsoever, and that's okay. I'm going to do my best to keep it simple, and a lot of this is going to be reiterated tomorrow in a lot of the presentations. This is very much just an overview because we do know that a lot of people tomorrow will not have seen the template yet either. So this is really just like a head start on the template. It's going to be completely a talk and not a workshop. So that's the main thing. We're going to be going through basically how to read a big code base. So I'm going to show you in a second that this template is a bit intimidating. That was done by design. We want you to kind of feel like you're working on something real. In school, it's very common that, you might, have an assignment with, a couple files, maybe, you make it maybe like 10 files or so. Maybe you have everything on one file. I don't know, right? But this project, the folders, the file placements, naming everything was designed to make this like the most real experience you could get. Hopefully it feels like you're really, taking issues and completing them and, putting in changes and doing all that fun stuff you do in like a real work environment. So we're really hoping to give you that experience. And we also just want to give you all the important information about the project. There's a lot of stuff that I'm going to be honest, as well as I'm going to, in 3 slides, talk about, READMEs, yada, yada. I have not documented literally everything. I'm going to do my best to tell you as much as has not been documented in this presentation about the technologies, and also just trying to familiarize you with some of the things you're going to be working with inside the template. So yeah, the Hack the Temple Starter Project, because we are doing this challenge-based hackathon format, the main thing about this event is that you're going to be given a pre-existing project. And I'm actually going to give you a little preview into what that project is going to look like ahead of all the people tomorrow. Spoilers. The other thing is, if you go on Discord right now, Forrest, at some point, maybe it has happened or maybe it hasn't happened yet, but you'll actually be able to go and find the link to the starter project right now. So if any of you want to look at the code in advance, it's already out as far as I know. It's been out for multiple days. I've been developing the template in the open. So it kind of just exists if you want to take a look. But it's a pretty big and scary template. And like I said, that's okay. That's kind of the point of this event. We know it's going to be scary. We know it's going to be intimidating, but that's kind of the experience we want to create. And we kind of want to show people what it's like to work on something of this scale, because that's just not something you might see in school. So yeah, let's look at the project. I'm going to open up the project in the browser now. So I'm going to have to exit the slides, but I'm going to show you guys what it's actually going to look like when you get it on the day of. So we're going to go over here to this. I definitely actually have it in another window. Don't know why that window closed, but that is okay. So what you're going to be given out of the bat, the main prompt that you're going to be given tomorrow is the main prompt is you're going to be creating your very own e-commerce store web app type project, if that makes sense. It's up to you what you want to put on there, what kind of products, what kind of what theming you want to do, but you've been given basically this shell of an e-commerce site, if you will. So looking at this site right now, you can see there's a non-existent nav bar. It says store logo. There's a big list of products that say example 1, 2, 3, etc., etc. And you're also given a bunch of other pages. So we've given you basically the main flow of everything you need to get started. And that main flow is the flow of going to a product, clicking buy, and then being able to create an order. An order is essentially hey, I've actually bought the product. You're probably wondering is this real? Am I sending data? A lot of that data is hard-coded in code. There are going to be challenges where you're going to have to build these pages out. And that's kind of what, although it says, it is actually committing those operations, but you're going to have to fill in quite a lot of stuff to make this site feel real and legitimate, if that makes sense. So you're given this main flow of you can create orders. The other thing you're given is you're also given a very simple login system. So within the app, there are 2 kinds of users. There are admins admins can do certain things like create products, they can delete products, update products, other things amongst those that I'm trying not to spoil in challenges. And then there are regular users, customers, if you will. So if you go over to login, you're going to be able to, eventually there might be a challenge, for building this login form. But right now, this is all hard set to use information that's already, given to an admin account. And once you've logged in, you'll be able to see here that instead of saying like sign in, log in, it actually says log out, because at this moment, you actually are logged in as an account. Although it's not super obvious because of, how little stuff there is there. That is the gist of it. So, oh, sorry. No, that's a really good point. Sorry. For the recording, Zara just pointed out we should probably zoom in a little bit on here. So yeah, that is the project you're going to be given. That's like what it looks like. Now let's jump over to the code just for a little bit of fun. So what you're looking at here is the main root directory you're going to get. And if you start going through it, you're going to quickly realize there's quite a lot of stuff in here. There's the client folder, inside the client folder, there's all these other folders, there's all these guys and these guys and these guys. And there's a lot of stuff. Okay. Right. There's like a lot of stuff. And this is kind of scary, right? Like there's like, oh, like, what is this? Why are there so many folders? What is going on here? This is crazy. How am I going to figure all that out? And that's okay, because today I'm going to basically tell you all the files that matter, because there's a lot of stuff in there that I'm going to be honest, you'll probably never touch. And that's okay. That's kind of the point. If you want to touch it, you can, but you probably won't have to. So yeah, brief look at the code. It's kind of spooky, right? Like there's a lot of stuff. It's pretty overwhelming, for myself included, I'll be honest, right? And that's okay, because number one, I also want to point out, just in case that was pretty scary, all of the challenges, this is going to be an example challenge you'll see tomorrow, will have very, hopefully, well-written documentation. For example, this is one where we very specifically say like, hey, this challenge, you'll probably have to modify this file. Here is a link to a W3 Schools thing on how to do X. We try to make it as simple as possible. Not all the challenges will be like this, but I'd say roughly 75% of them have like, these are the files you need to edit. Here are some resources that will probably help you do this challenge, et cetera, et cetera. So although it's like a very overwhelming project, like how you would in like a legitimate work environment, we're not just going to like literally throw you in and be like, figure it out. In like an actual job, your manager would be like, hey, you should probably check out these files in the code base or check out this area of the whatever to try and get it going. You know what I mean? Just realized I'm not in full screen, so we'll kind of pull out of there. But anyways, so let's say you don't know what to do. You're really confused, and this doesn't just apply to our project. This could apply to like anything at all. When in doubt, you got to check this fancy little file called a README, very aptly named. The README is the file that you need to read to understand a lot of the information about a project. Any nice project with nice, clean documentation hopefully has at a bare minimum a very nice README that gives you some of the things you need to get started. So if you check out the README that we provide, we have stuff like setup instructions, we have explanations of the keywords in the projects, we have a list of useful files, and a whole lot more that will hopefully help you get started. So here's like a little bit of a screenshot. If you go on GitHub right now, this is what you'll see. And you'll see the first thing we have on here is actually a little list of technologies that we're going to be using within the project. So I think the first thing I'm going to do in this presentation is kind of break these technologies down. A lot of these will be covered or have already been covered in the last couple of presentations. But I'm going to go over them nonetheless very quickly. And some of them I'm going to like not cover very much because they'll have their own full-length things tomorrow. So the first one I'm going to talk about is React. What React is basically it's a JavaScript library for building web apps. I'm not going to talk about it much because there's a whole presentation all about it tomorrow. Okay, so definitely come to that. It's one of the first ones. I'd say like 50% of the challenges are in this. So you're going to need to know how to use that to do a bunch of the challenges. So definitely stay tuned there. But the big thing about it is it's officially like the most popular, way of doing this now. It officially overthrew this fancy guy called jQuery. That was like the big JavaScript library for a long time. But React is now like the big kahuna, if you will. He's like the guy that everyone's trying to beat now. He's like the most popular one. So that's why we're using that one for this project. And it also uses a lot of the more modern paradigms around rendering and all that fancy stuff. But I'll be talking about that tomorrow, so I'm not going to talk about that here. The next one I'm going to talk about is TypeScript. So in Shirley's presentation, you learned a bit about JavaScript. TypeScript is JavaScript with types. So some of you who are just starting to take 1405, you probably haven't heard of this idea of what a type is. Those of you who've already like taken 1406, you'll already be kind of familiar with this. A type is essentially just a way of telling a value what it is. So let's say you have, you're declaring a variable. a language like JavaScript or Python, these languages are dynamically typed, meaning that we don't actually check what they are until we actually run the code. And this isn't great sometimes because sometimes we want to know what things are so that we know the code won't break, if that makes sense. So in dynamically typed languages, you don't actually have to tell variables what they are. You can just be like x equals 1, and Python or JavaScript will figure out it's a number. But in really big code bases, sometimes that's a problem because the code will just have really complicated types and really complicated things that you just don't have the brain capacity to have all the context for. So you kind of need to have types that describe those things. So in our project, we've used TypeScript to give you basically, if you kind of look at these examples here, you'll be able to see what comes back from a lot of the code we've given you. So the code sample on the screen right here is a function called getProducts. The getProducts method calls something called the product service and invokes a function called all. When you hover on the all function, you'll see that we see the return type of this is an object that has an ID, a title, a description, a price, and an image URL, essentially describing a product, which is what we're looking for. We are creating a variable that is set to the collection of products. So without TypeScript, you would not be able to get these fancy, like, hey, this is what you're getting back from these methods. So we're hoping that really helps you out when you're trying to actually work in the code base. The other thing we've done is normally, as I mentioned, the code would, it would break if we use the wrong types in wrong places. We've actually turned the compiler the compiling steps that check for that off so that if you don't want to have to write types, you don't have to. It's purely just to help you out while you're, working with our existing functions that we've given you. So if you want to write, literally like let's equal x equals 1, you can still do that. That strict typing is completely turned off. You don't need to worry about that. But basically, this is just going to help you out when you're trying to figure out what some of the code that we've given you is going to actually give back. The next thing I'm going to briefly talk about is this guy called Express. Richard already talked about this a bunch. This was in the last presentation, but Express is a JavaScript framework for building APIs. So what is an API? I'm just going to talk about it just in case. An API is basically the acronym for an application programming interface. That probably doesn't mean anything to anyone, but we can kind of go a little bit deeper and say okay, so what is an interface? An interface is essentially like a contract. It basically just describes what we expect from something. So in the case of our app, right, when you sign a contract, you basically say hey, I'm expecting this if I do this, if that makes sense, right? In our app, the contract is built through our endpoints, which in order to understand that, you need to understand what an endpoint is. An endpoint is essentially a unique URL that is tied to a function. So that might seem very convoluted, but what that really looks like is a contract where when I say get products, I expect a list of products to come back. And that's the main thing that's the main sort of what an API is when you expect this, you expect something to happen. And in this case, we are asking for the products and therefore are getting the products. To give you a little bit of an example of what that actually looks like, because this is just a screenshot of mine, right? If I head on over to, I don't know, this little guy over here, I throw this here. This is what you guys are going to have tomorrow. And I throw this in the browser. This is the same data, just in a less nicely formatted way, but this is how you can actually see what you're getting back. When I go to this URL or this endpoint, I'm getting a bunch of products. This is a list of products. It's kind of hard to tell because the data is kind of poorly formatted, but if I blow it up there, you can see there's a big word that says products, and you can see title, example product, and a bunch of stuff like that. But it comes back in JSON format, which was covered in the previous presentation. So I'm not going to talk about that too much. But the idea is when I ask for this, I expect that. And the shape of that body is the contract, right? If you don't get what you're expecting back, then your code might be expecting that shape, and therefore it might break if you don't get it. So that's that. I'll jump back over to the slides here. The next thing we're using is this thing called Prisma. So Prisma is a library that reads and writes to the database. So there's a bunch of places in the code where you're going to want to save stuff. So functions like this, const products equals await Prisma dot product find many. What that's doing is it's finding many products. The dot Prisma is basically just how you ask Prisma for things. When you say dot and then put the name of something, you're basically looking for that model. A model is a class that represents one of the tables in the database. And you're basically saying, find many of the product. So you're getting many products back. that's probably the simplest one. Here's a little bit more of a complicated one. I've included like the function signature, which does look a little bit complicated, but please don't be scared by that. The main thing you're actually looking for is the line underneath the function signature. What this one's doing is it's finding the first product where the ID I've specified in is the one that's in my signature here. Basically what's going on is I want to be able to pull in the product with this ID, if that makes sense. So every product will have a unique identifier. I need to find a specific product. This line of code it will find the product that I've asked for. So all it's doing is it's finding a specific product. Prism is a little bit complicated. I will be very honest. So we've given you a lot of functions explaining how to use it. We've given you a lot of example methods using Prisma. So hopefully you don't even really need to write too much of this on your own, but there are a few Prisma related challenges you will run into while you're going through it. So what this results in is this architecture that I'm about to show you here. Some of you might not be familiar with the word architecture. Architecture is just basically like similar to like real building architecture. Basically, architecture is just a high-level view of what our app looks like. So the architecture of our application is we basically have this client-server architecture. There's a client that through HTTP requests, through our endpoints, through our API, through that contract, reaches out to the service, which has the API, it gives us back our data. And the reason why it can get us that data is it communicates to the database through Prisma, which basically what it's doing in the background is it's writing SQL queries. That's just that's a way of communicating with the database. You don't need to worry about that. Prisma will handle that for you. You don't have to write a line of SQL, I promise. The next thing I'm going to cover is basically all the important files in the project, okay? I'm probably going to have to look at the list here a few times, but the list I'm about to show you is on the README, which is really great. So the main thing I want to highlight here, as mentioned on the slide, is basically there's a lot of code in this thing. You're probably not going to have to look at all of it. There's some things that I've like intentionally tried to hide away as much as I can so that it's not confusing for anyone, especially stuff to do with like the authentication system or like some of the middleware that the API has like put on it by default. You don't need to know what those words are, but I'm basically saying I've tried to hide things so that it's not too confusing. On the README, you'll see this big list of important files and folders. These are probably like the most important things. These are, I don't know, the main things, if you will, that you'll probably run into while you're, trying to complete some of the challenges. I'm going to go through each of these. I'm going to show you the files now so you have an idea of like kind of what they are for tomorrow. So the first one we're going to look at is main.tsx within the client. Main.tsx is essentially like the entry point. And the reason why it's really important is it describes how your pages are set up, like which URL corresponds to which part of your code. So if you're trying to like add a new page or figure out how a page leads to a certain URL, that is the file for that, if that makes sense. The next one I'm going to show you is the pages folder. So each of these, the home component, the admin component, the work component, I will explain tomorrow. All of those are found within this folder right here that I'm kind of hovering with my mouse. You'll see here that there's one folder for each of these, green texted guys right here. Within this pages folder. And that's just because I basically created one folder for all the code related to each page. So if you're, working with your friends, they can each work on a separate page without, all those pages being like mangled together or something like that. So let's just take like the login page. If you go into the login page, you'll see some code that describes what was on the login page. I'll be explaining how HTML works tomorrow, but this is the code you'll be editing to, like, for example, change the text that appeared on the login page. So if you were to update that, that would update the header there, if that makes sense. The next file I'm going to explain is the components folder. Components are essentially where reusable pieces of like front-end code go. I'll be explaining this in detail tomorrow when I cover the idea of like what a component is and like what that means for React and stuff like that. But the main thing is that anything that's like very reusable kind of goes into this components folder. The next folder I want to cover is this folder called infrastructure/service API. So this is where it kind of gets a little bit confusing because I kind of have to attempt to explain why this folder is called the infrastructure folder, which requires you to understand the idea of infrastructure, which is a little bit confusing without a lot of other context. And I'm going to do my best to explain it right now. So basically, there's this idea of like, what is infrastructure? And I made this really awful diagram 10 minutes before this presentation that I'm not going to pretend is a very good diagram, but there's a lot of things that you kind of have to understand for that folder name to make sense. But the main idea behind infrastructure is code you need to communicate with things that are not within your project. So let's say I need to communicate with the client. That means that my API would be considered infrastructure. Let's say I need to communicate with a database, whatever code that is evoking the database is probably infrastructure. Let's say it's the client trying to contact the server, then that code is probably considered infrastructure. This word infrastructure basically comes from this fancy thing called like hexagonal architecture that I'm not going to try and explain in 30 seconds because that's like a little bit convoluted. But basically the idea is when you think of, client server, you don't tend to think of maybe the client as like the center of the app. You tend to think of maybe the API as the center. And when you look at hexagonal architecture, what you want to do is you want to basically think of everything around you as not part of your core app, if that makes sense. And that's why we consider it infrastructure, because if you let the infrastructure influence your code, it'll make your code messy and a bunch of stuff. I don't have enough time to really explain it. You're just gonna have to trust me out a little bit. And I'm aware I'm not explaining it super well, but that's okay. But the reason why we basically have the folder inside of the front end called infrastructure is because all of the code that reaches out to the API is stored in here. So if you go into the service API folder and we go to accounts, you'll see methods like this that basically send a JSON request to the server asking to log in. Or if we go over to products, you'll see something like fetch products. That is how the client will ask for all the products. So stuff like that is good to know. And similarly, in the service, there's also an infrastructure folder because likewise, the service also has to communicate to a couple things, such as the API and the database. So all the code related to the database is also stored in an infrastructure folder. And all the code related to the API is also stored in an infrastructure folder. So that's kind of why that is the way it is. I know I'm not doing a great job explaining what the folder is, but that's like a whole like 2-hour presentation in and of itself. You kind of have to take my word for it, but it is what it is. The next file I'm going to explain is I'm going to go over to the router.ts file. So this is a really important file, especially for those of you who are paying close attention to Richard's presentation, because this is kind of like how you build out the API interface contract that I've been talking about. So what's going on here is I'm basically saying like underneath this URL, you should probably evoke this code. And this is kind of like this is the root of it all. If you were to right click on these and click on like go to definition, you'll see that each of these has code that is then associated with each of these little routes. So this whole folder, this whole like routes API folder, this is essentially where all of those queries, where that contract, where that API is built up. So if you ever need to add a new endpoint, it's probably in that folder. Or if you ever need to expose something to the client, you'll be doing it there. The next folder I'm going to be covering is the services folder. So outside of the infrastructure folder, we have this folder called services. The idea behind a service is that if you look up like service object pattern or something like that, again, I don't have the time to cover that in full, but one service basically represents like a unit of executable work. That just means like a service will execute some code for you. This is where your business logic lives. So anything regarding like, let's say it's like, checking whether they got their password right? So let's go to the authentication service. You'll probably see some code that verifies whether their password that they entered is correct or something like that. So the services are where the actual like business logic goes on. It's where, for example, looking up whether their account exists, looking up whether, we need to create a new customer. I don't know, all that fancy stuff that happens in services. So the main pattern you're probably going to see when you look at the code base is the API endpoints, those routes are going to call out to something within the services folder. The reason why those are separate is because it's very hard to test those things when they're mixed together. And again, that I will be covering in a presentation tomorrow. It's kind of another thing I'd like to cover in full, but it's not something I want to cover right now just because it is as complicated as it is. And then the last folder the last little piece I want to talk about in the important file section is this schema file. So this schema.prisma file is essentially describing everything in your database. So if you ever need to add a new table or store something new inside the database, this is the file you're probably going to be modifying. So let's say you wanted to add like a new column to product, or you wanted products to store something new. You'd basically be adding new lines on this file. Any challenges related to this will describe how you actually like fully do that, but that's like the very rough gist of how you'll be doing it, is you'll need to be modifying this file right here. So that's definitely an important one. I've already covered what this is to the best of my ability in 30 seconds. But yeah, that is essentially everything I'm going to tell you about the template today. So hopefully that was pretty useful. Hopefully for the at least first half of the presentation, I kept it pretty simple. But does anybody have any questions about anything I've talked about today? other than the things that are like super duper complicated that I apologize for kind of covering too fast. Yes. Because basically we're giving you, like, it's not turned on as strict, so it's no different. Like, it's only helping you because the strict is turned to false. So it's no different than if you just had JavaScript, but with types that tell you things. Well, we are using it because some people are you're able to see the types of the methods we created. So if you accidentally don't await one of our functions, it'll give you, like, it'll tell you that you didn't await it. Any other questions? Anybody? Yes. Oh, okay. All right. No problem. Any other questions? Anybody at all? Okay. Well, if there's no other questions, thank you all for coming. It was super great having you all here tonight. We're excited to have you all here in the morning, and we wish you a good night's sleep, everybody.